So my channel's gotten a large number of comments recently. I mean, this has been really great. I've enjoyed reading all of them, enjoyed commenting and engaging in discussion. But I also noticed that an enormous number of people who have come onto my channels have been atheists and have made my belief in God sort of an issue that they went after. Of course, I should have suspected this. I know I'm attracting a lot of Sargon fans, and that includes a lot of atheists and new atheists and cultural libertarians. And don't get me wrong, I love discussing God and metaphysics and the meaning of life and all this stuff, but I noticed that when I engaged a lot of atheist commenters on my channel and followed up in chats and the likes, I noticed that a large part of what separated our worldviews wasn't even necessarily the existence of God or anything metaphysical. It was a variety of beliefs about goodness and our responsibility to the past and the future, and beliefs about culture. And I got the distinct impression that a lot of these people who were new atheist or cultural libertarians felt sort of betrayed by the fact that I had very different views, even though I sort of shared their contempt for the social justice warriors and the progressive left. And of course, I know these are probably Sargon fans. They have the same sort of secular, new atheist, cultural libertarian worldviews that pushes back against some of the excesses of progressivism, but still embraces the core liberal ideas and the core modern ideas. And this wasn't just one conversation. This was many conversations that all had sort of the same pattern. And it really got me thinking. I mean, we were ostensibly talking about the existence of God and a metaphysical concept, but at the same time, there were these other divisions that were incredibly consistent in between people I talked to. Yet none of these differences of opinions really had anything to do with the existence of God, strictly speaking. And I thought a good response would be to make a video outlining sort of 5 principles that separate my worldview from the worldview I've seen consistently expressed by new atheists and cultural libertarians. And I know, this is a newer YouTube channel, and already I'm making a video that's going to be highly critical to probably a large percentage of my subscribers. But heck, this is experimental, so let's do it. So here we go. 5 reasons why I'm not a new atheist that have nothing to do with the existence of God. I realized when I started writing out a list of these principles that they told a story of my own conversion away from atheism gradually. And that in turn told an implicit story about the emergence of new atheism as a social phenomenon in the late 2000s. And I feel like I have to go back and review a little bit of that. Now, the emergence of new atheism as a cultural and identitarian movement really developed in the years between 2006 and 2008. And it was largely a reaction to a number of discrete institutional failures that occurred. The Bush administration was seen as a complete failure, the war in Iraq was collapsing, and the financial collapse was on the horizon. But I think even to understand this, one needs to go back a little bit further, to the 1990s. Probably a lot of people who are listening to this channel are younger. They might not remember the 90s as vividly as I do, but the 90s were seen as an era of complete optimism. They were seen as sort of the end of history. The Soviet Union had collapsed, and from that point forward, many people on both the left and the right believed that the West had really come up with the solution to most problems that had plagued the world up until that point. Democracy and capitalism were seen as stable and effective ways of governing both the economy and the political systems of the world. Not only that, it seemed that all countries and all societies would naturally develop not only into democracies, but into economies that could sustain a high level of growth that would keep everyone employed and everyone sort of being equal participants in the economy that allowed them to have a good middle-class way of life. And so you had articles like Francis Fukuyama, The End of History, where he described all the main conflicts and ideological wars of how society should be run, governed, and guided on a macrocosmic level to be effectively solved. And at this point, you see both the left and the right develop two very distinct ideologies during this time. On the left, you see the development of multiculturalism. This was the idea that cultures were totally equal, simply aesthetic preferences, and that all individuals and all societies, regardless of these cultural preferences, had the right to grow economically and should be expected to grow economically and achieve the same economic status as those in the West, regardless of the institutions and the cultural practices that they adhere to. And similarly, on the right, you have sort of this very, very optimistic liberalism and sort of libertarian attitude that all that is really needed to govern a society is the operation of the free market. And once again, since this will naturally cause high growth rates, and this will be sort of impervious to differences in culture, one would expect that American democracy and capitalism and wealth would spread universally around the world. So fast forward to 2006 and 2007, and this narrative of the 90s is in total crisis. Not only do you have September 11th demonstrating that the world is not necessarily going to just become universally peaceful, you have the utter failure of democracy and capitalism to really enter the Muslim world in a large way. And people oftentimes forget when they talk about the Iraq War that the principle of essentially going into a country and forcibly extending democratic ideas was not exclusively a component of the Bush administration. There were early precedents for it in the Clinton administration, where you see this attempt to bomb people into democracy, like in the war in Serbia. And of course, this made a little bit of sense, right? People thought that these democratic institutions were universal, and if they weren't working in a country, it must be someone's fault, namely the dictator. So why not try to bomb or remove that dictator? But of course, these perceptions that were popular in the 90s were very, very obviously not working in the Muslim world in 2006 to 2008. And people were casting about for explanations. Why had the much prophesied end of history not actually come? Why were democratic institutions not extending themselves to these other countries? Why was this happening? And this is where New Atheism really came in. And the solution was quite simple. Perhaps the problem wasn't these discrete dictators, whose removal obviously didn't change the situation. Perhaps the problem was religion. And this dovetailed quite nicely because it was an explanation for the failure of the Iraq War and Afghanistan and September 11th, and also an explanation for the failure of the Bush administration. And coincidentally, it also coincided with the main villain in a very popular cultural war issue at the time, namely gay marriage. In each of these cases, the villain was quite clear. The reason for the stupidity and the evil and the mistakes was religion and the belief in God. And in each of the cases, the solution was obviously science, more technocracy, more hard-hitting analysis. And you see here how the New Atheist narrative really rescued the optimism and the idea of the end of history that was popular in the 90s from a lot of events that I think should have caused a much deeper cultural reconsideration of that optimism. The narrative was clear. First, science was the only proper method of human inquiry. Second, if one adopted the idea that pleasure was good and pain was bad, one could sort of construct a scientific utilitarianism that could then be used to solve most questions or put most questions into a scientific framework. From this point of view, it was clear that there was a natural progress in human history, that if one took into consideration religion, all cultures were more or less equal, if we could account for the fact that some still clung to their ignorant religious beliefs, and that effectively we had solved the problem of human progress if we could get rid of religion, and most of the considerations people had in the past regarding questions about good and evil and the ultimate meaning weren't actually very meaningful questions to begin with. And so you see how the New Atheist narrative essentially saves the ideology of multiculturalism and the expectation of continuous growth by labeling religion as the culprit and essentially saying that this is the reason why the expected progress was not witnessed in the decade of the 2000s. And for a while, I thought that this narrative was quite satisfactory myself. But as I began to examine the world around me and my own beliefs, I began to understand that the points that comprise the new atheist narrative, not even necessarily the belief in God, but the assumptions around it, I found to be false. And I'll go into details about this. Alright, so the first conviction that really set me aside from the atheist community was my understanding that science is necessary, but not sufficient to answer all human questions. Now, this obviously stands in contradiction to a somewhat typical atheist assumption that any properly posed question is necessarily an empirical or scientific one. Now, obviously, this presupposes a worldview that's called scientific materialism. It assumes that all true things are some subset of observable physical effects. Basically, you can imagine the universe under this worldview as simply just being physical objects under physical laws. Now, alright, so what's wrong with this worldview? The first one is that it's just manifestly not true that you can answer all questions from the perspective of this materialist worldview. Laying aside questions about aesthetics or morality for one moment, we could even ask truth claims that might not be answered from this perspective. For instance, we could ask where the order in the universe or where the justifications for the physical laws themselves comes from. That can't be answered by observation, since it's one of the fundamental assumptions that governs the observation to begin with. Moreover, we could just ask ourselves some really meta question like, is the observable universe an illusion? This question can be answered, it's coherent, it potentially could have an answer, but at the same time it cannot be answered by any appeal to the physical laws or science. And of course, the examples I gave here are very metaphysical, they're very abstract, and a well-versed materialist will probably accuse me of selecting totally impractical examples that are designed to meaninglessly dismiss the worldview. But the problem is, in addition to sort of being not exactly true at a philosophical level, the whole methodology of reducing every question people ask to questions of science is that it doesn't really work at a practical level either. People ask themselves many questions over the course of their lives and over the course of their daily actions, and usually they involve measuring competing value claims. And these are typically just not well-posed scientific questions. So this methodology of saying that a question's only coherent if it's scientific just doesn't work at a practical level either. And really, this failure has only been compounded by a lot of times people who are embracing this scientific materialist worldview trying to superimpose their preferences onto science itself. So you'll get ridiculous claims by Sam Harris that he's somehow scientifically proven the correct morality through neuroscience. This is a ridiculous claim. The whole question is one that's not posed properly as a scientific question. But that doesn't stop him from taking whatever preferred morality has and saying that's the scientific result. Now, of course, all philosophies and all perspectives have problems like this, but usually when you have a certain tool, it either works very well at a practical level, or it sort of works very well at an abstract level. And what you see with a lot of these reductionist perspectives employed by new atheists and materialists, they neither work very well at an abstract level, they've got these very strong philosophical problems, but they don't work well as practical means either when you really take a look at it. And the only real reason they exist is to sort of simplify reality to the point where they can claim that they have the entire truth and they do not need to consider a broader perspective. Now, I used to be a scientific materialist, and I really started questioning scientific materialism as an overarching worldview when I started entering into higher education and studied higher physics. And I took a look at some of the candidates for the theory of everything, the unified theory of physics. And I looked at the equations, and I remember asking myself, if I took these equations and told myself, these equations are the answers to all questions in the universe, and if you have a question that's not answered by these equations, then it is improperly posed, ultimately. And I remember thinking to myself, that is manifestly not true. Even with a model that explains all physical events, there are still things that the mind can legitimately question that those equations cannot answer. So the second concept that really set me aside from the new atheist community is the realization that progress, independent of a standard, is a meaningless concept. Now, I guess this is sort of meaningless in and of itself, and most sophisticated atheists will understand the concept if you bring it up explicitly. But it is amazing in how many ways the assumption of some implicit and universal standard of progress is smuggled into our language. We talk about evolution like it's some mechanism for delivering good things over the course of time to a species. We hear phrases like being on the right side of history, and even have politicians that reference the current year when they're asked to justify some kind of program they're proposing. And this all goes back to the assumption that simply the advancement of time leads to better and better things, and there's a natural force of progress in the world. But there's nothing like this that's necessarily guaranteed in science, let alone in history. And a lot of times I hear people discussing evolution or the increment of time as if by its nature it will deliver good things. And every now and again I think that there are people in the new atheist community who get it. They see things like idiocracy and they hear things like Devo, and you understand that perhaps evolution could lead to things you don't like. It could lead to a stupider population. And that would still be evolution. There's no such thing as devolution. If you get something you don't like from evolution, it's still evolution. Evolution is simply what survives. But for every new atheist I hear that talks about evolution in this more sophisticated way, with the understanding that it can deliver bad things, there are people in the new atheist, and in particular the progressive new atheist community, who act as if the passage of time itself is an indicator of better things that are to come. And this is particularly ridiculous when it comes to how the atheist community talks about itself. Now, I know these aren't the most sophisticated people in the community, but you go online and you hear of all these memes. Atheism is the next evolution. Atheism is unstoppable. Atheism is the future of humanity. This is ridiculous. Go to the Pew polling on world religions and look at the rate of religious growth. Take a look at the projections. Almost every religion is stable or climbing except for one, which is falling like a brick, and that is the ranks of the unreligious. If it's just a matter of what survives into the future, atheism currently isn't doing very well. Not that it should matter to anybody, but it makes the meme ridiculous. The third concept that separates me from the new atheists: there is good and evil that goes beyond pleasure and pain. Now, I understand the last concept I brought up was a little bit of a straw man. This is something that's believed by a lot of atheists who don't understand philosophy very well, and it's something that I didn't even really believe when I was a new atheist. I understood that you had to name a principle in order to actually measure progress, even in evolution. However, a lot of more sophisticated atheists will take you aside and go, well, that's fine. We can use sort of a utilitarian model, such that pleasure and pain is the standard of utility. And for those of you who are interested, this is actually the exact approach that Sam Harris takes when he tries to scientifically explain a basis for morality. Morality is simply what causes pleasure to the brain, and we can measure this as a physical phenomenon. Now, this is a coherent concept. You could measure the progress of evolution as the production of more and more pleasure. But once we really examine it, there are a lot of problems with this concept. First of all, there's the simple historical fact that the development of pleasure receptors was a tool to help human survival. The pleasure itself wasn't some kind of point of humanity. But even beyond that, there's a more philosophical problem. And that is, how do you define pleasure? Presumably you define it in terms of a chemical reaction happening to some subject. But is it a human subject? Is it an animal subject? And if it's an animal subject, are we then responsible for controlling pleasure and pain among the animals? Are we morally obligated to track all animals down and prevent them from experiencing pain as they do in nature? The problem grows additionally complicated if you think about it in terms of evolution. Are we therefore to guide our evolution, experience more and more pleasure? Will we have computers run the world and then retreat into matrix-like cells, and then evolve to experience more and more pleasure, slowly atrophying away until the only element of ourselves are dopamine releasers and dopamine receptors with no attendant personality or no attendant form other than just the ability to experience pleasure? That's where the logic takes you. And of course, people who defend the position of a pleasure and plain utilitarian model will say that these are sort of hyperboles, they're designed to explode the example, and you can come up with ridiculous examples for almost any philosophy, which is true. And they'll say something like, well, the obvious solution is to define pleasure in terms of it happening to a human. The only problem is then the philosophy has to define what a human is properly conceived of. What are the essential qualities of a human and being human? And that opens up an entirely different dimension of morality, something that cannot so easily be put into a utilitarian model of progress. The fourth concept that really separates me from the new atheists generally is that I believe cultures differ and that culture itself matters. Now, this requires some explanation. It's actually quite common to hear new atheists talk about advanced cultures and less advanced cultures, and at what stage this culture is at or that culture is at. But usually they're referring to technological advancements, and I'm really not speaking to that directly. There's a large difference in how cultures approach problems and even how they conceive of problems. And this goes well beyond a culture's progress on some technological tree. And the comparison is the most clear in the case of Islam versus the West. Now, most people don't realize, but Islam has been technologically equal to the West, or even more advanced than the West, for a majority of its history, and probably right up until the 19th century. Yet at the same time, the way Islam approached the questions of philosophy, of science, of individuals' relationship to faith and morality, and to an individual's relationship to the government, have been massively different and consistently different throughout their philosophies for 1,000 years now. Now, I think a lot of atheists, like Sargon of Akkad, have really come around on this point and are probably starting to see some of the sense in this perspective. But still, all the time, I hear new atheists act like Islam's just got to catch up with the West. If it just catches up in terms of money, in terms of technology, the money and technology, by its own accord, are going to transform its philosophy into something that looks Western. But this is just 90s optimism coming back. It's the same misperception that got us into the war in Iraq that we couldn't possibly win. Islam has an entirely different way of viewing the world, and it's nothing like the Western way of viewing the world, and we shouldn't expect it to be like that. If I were to speculate why there's so much resistance on this point, is that if we acknowledge that cultures differ, like Islamic culture and Western culture, then we have to at some point acknowledge that our culture matters. Not just the technology in our culture, but the institutions, the learning, the history that we teach, the perspective on reality that we impart to young people. That matters beyond just exploring more and more in the scientific method. And that has a distinct character that needs to be preserved if the approach that we take in our particular civilization is to be preserved. And a lot of people don't like that because it seems to imply a responsibility to carry on that culture and to, if possible, improve it. All right, the last concept that really separated me from the atheist community, and this is the real one that sets me aside as a traditionalist and not as a cultural libertarian. I believe that the voices from the past philosophers, the past thinkers, the pre-moderns and the ancients, they are worth listening to. The people who thought a long time ago are valuable because they think in different ways than we do in our contemporary society. In some ways, this is the culmination of the other 4 points. I started by realizing that there are human questions that aren't scientific, that there are questions of value and questions of progress and questions of goodness that can't be simply solved by appeal to engineering some kind of utilitarian end. And moreover, we have questions about how our culture is maintained and preserved that still require us to ask questions like, what does it mean to be a good human? What does it mean to be a responsible citizen? What does it mean to have a good society? And these were the same questions that people were asking 2,000, 3,000 years ago. And if we think that everything's just determined by science and everything's dependent on technology, then maybe we can dismiss those peoples. But if these are questions that are outside of science, their opinions on these fundamental issues about what it means to be human are as legitimate as our own in modern day society. And if we don't look back to them, we are blinding ourselves to an enormous amount of human knowledge. I think of all 5 of the points I listed here, this is the one that's the hardest for modern people to really grapple with. Because modernity and the modern technological world is sort of based on the understanding that we can overcome essential human weaknesses. We're going to get to the point where we don't have any more war. We're going to get to the point where we don't have any more political corruption. This stuff is all in the past. We've learned enough and we're never going to have to deal with that again. We're past that. But are we so past that? I look out in the world today and I see a world that isn't so much different from the world that Cicero described in Rome, that Socrates described in Athens. These are human situations and they're human questions that have to be answered. And the technological progress that brought us from that point in the past to this point now doesn't really change that problem. So I guess that ends the list. These are the 5 principles that I hold, that I find separate me from the new atheist, that have nothing to do with the belief in God. Now, at this point, I know there are people who have listened to this entire monologue and are getting ready to write a comment in my section, getting angry with me, saying, how can you say that an atheist can't believe these things? Atheism just means you don't believe in God. Yes, I know that's the case. An atheist could believe all 5 of these concepts and still be an atheist. As a matter of fact, for most of history before the 20th century, almost all atheists did believe these 5 principles. This is only a critique of a certain type of atheist that's appeared in very recent times. And if you're not that person, this does not apply to you. This does not mean you have to believe in God or anything like that. That being said, I would love to hear people's opinions on these concepts. I'd like to hear what you have to say, and I'm looking forward to talking with you in the comments and possibly in chat. Have a wonderful night.